Hey guys, what's going on? It is Ash here coming at you today with another Pro Tips episode in Clash Royale. Today I have first-time guest DarthJarJar on the channel. Really excited to talk to him all about Three Musketeer gameplay, technique, and strategy. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome him in. Alright guys, so I am here with DarthJarJar. DarthJarJar is our Pro Tips interviewee for today's episode. Really excited to have him on. The first time he's ever been on the channel, and he's come with very high recommendations. Before we get into that, why don't we go ahead and say hi. What's going on, DarthJarJar?
Hey, nothing much. Just happy to be on here.
We're very happy to have you, man. Want to give us a brief kind of rundown on your credentials, so to speak, as a pro player? Any memorable tournament finishes or anything like that?
Yeah, so in terms of tournament finishes in the Super Magical Cup, I've come in a top 4 placing 2 times during Season 2, and then during the Season 2 finale, I finished second place to CMQ in a 16-player field, which I thought was very strong. So I was pretty happy about that. I was using 2 different Three Musketeer decks in that tournament placing. And then in terms of in-game tournaments, before the tournament update, I came in the top 3 of, I believe, either 2 or 3 separate 1,000-player tournaments. And then since then have also done pretty well in some of those. So
wow,
yeah, that's
man.
pretty much my best finishes.
Very, very impressive. I'm jealous of all those top 3 finishes. I've never finished that high in a 1,000-man tournament. So what I'd like to do is talk about this deck that you're playing lately. Now, you're definitely well known in the community for being a really good Three Musketeer player. So what I want to do is talk about this new variation of the Three Musketeer. It's actually the Quad Musketeer, because you're playing the Three Musketeers as well as a regular Musketeer. And I kind of want to talk about the deck, and why don't you start out by just giving us a brief synopsis, an overview of the deck, and maybe any changes that you've made post this recent pretty big balance change update.
Yeah, so Giant Three Musketeers has always kind of been my main version, kind of my favorite version of a Three Musketeer deck. You also see kind of the lighter versions with Knight and Miner as the 2 tanks, which I also like to play sometimes, but I'm kind of the biggest fan of these big beatdown decks with Giant as a big tank. So kind of the change I made after the update was I used to have stuff like Princess and Barbarians to bait out what was so common, poisons or fireballs. Mm-hmm. But now after the update, you see a lot less of, you used to see poison in every deck, but now pretty much everyone's running lightning, which you'd think is kind of like a death sentence for Three Musketeers, right? Sure, it's a terrible trade. So, but I decided, I really wanted to keep playing it because it's my best deck. So this is a variation that I've been running some, and it works pretty well against different lightning decks because you have the Mega Minion and the Single Musketeer, which are both very good lightning targets, and then you can, once they lightning those, you can bring out the Three Musketeers. Or once you play the Three Musketeers, they lightning 2 of those, and you bring out the Mega Minion and the Single Musketeer. So it's kind of an adaptation from Fireball or Poison Bait to Lightning Bait.
Oh, I really like that idea. That's really cool. I didn't realize that was your mentality going in, but it makes a lot of sense, especially, as you said, with Lightning being so popular right now in the game. I noticed that you still have the Elixir Pump in this deck. Before we get into the offense and the defensive keys, why don't you talk a little bit about the Elixir Pump, the Elixir Collector? What are your thoughts on playing the Elixir Collector in this deck? Have you tried it without it after the balance update? And how has your decisions when you place it and if you place it changed since the balance update, since it's become more expensive?
Yeah, so I tried some Three Musketeer decks without the Elixir Collector, but especially in terms of the Giant version, it really doesn't work very well because what you need to do is build up a big push, usually near double Elixir, where you have kind of a big breakthrough push that your opponent just can't stop because you have so much more Elixir than them. And the best way, I think, still to do that is using the Elixir Pump. So I definitely think it's less strong after the update just because of the 6 for 8 trade. Or sorry, because it's a 6. It costs 6 now, even though it still generates 2 more elixir. It costs 6, so it trades worse against stuff like Rocket, stuff like Miner, stuff like Lightning. but it can actually act as good lightning bait as well, including in addition to the Musketeer Mega Minion. So that's what I've noticed, is that a lot of times people will lightning my elixir pumps, then I can bring out my other lightning targets, and a lot of times they don't have good answers. And then the other thing I would say is that in terms of playing it, it hasn't changed too much. It's just that now, if you want to play the elixir pump in a deck, you also have to be certain to include kind of cards that are cheap and really good on defense, because you're leaving yourself with only 4 elixir to defend anything they play against you, rather than 5 from before. So cards like the Mega Minion, cards like the Ice Spirit, the Ice Golem are going to be good options to include in a deck to defend any, install any rush that they send at you after you play the elixir pump.
That's really smart thinking too, especially baiting. You know, that's another good point. This deck is really all about taking away the opponent's direct damage and letting you kind of thrive with those 3 or 4 musketeers. So as far as the elixir collector goes, do you have any hard and fast rules about when you won't play it? For example, if you have it in your starting hand to start out a match, is that a big no-no now that it costs 6 elixir, or are you still going to play it if you have the right defensive cards in hand?
Yeah, I still usually play the elixir pump whenever I can if I start out in my starting hand, because I think that while, you know, sometimes you'll take a lot of damage, sometimes you'll even lose a tower, but it's kind of a risk-reward thing where if you don't play it, then you'll kind of end up in an awkward situation oftentimes where you're not able to build up the elixir advantage you need, and you might end up losing the game anyway. So I just try to kind of proactively build up an elixir advantage as fast as I can. A lot of times I'll take like 500 to 1,000 damage on a tower if they try to rush me. But it's worth it in terms of building up that big push later and knocking down their tower all at once.
And that actually ties in a lot to the overall deck philosophy. And, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems like a deck, if there ever was a deck, that you're not necessarily, you know, incredibly scared to lose a tower, because this has a lot of 3-crown potential. Are you playing this deck in that kind of fashion where, you know, you just mentioned you're okay with taking 500 or 1,000 damage, but it seems like you're playing more with an offensive mentality with this deck. Is that accurate, or...?
Yeah, that's very accurate. With kind of the giant 3 musketeer decks, you especially as opposed to the other decks, it has a lot of 3-crown potential, and so you can't be afraid to lose a tower if it's going to give you a big elixir advantage, and your options to stop it would be like elixir inefficient. So if your opponent spends like a lot of elixir and you don't quite have the cards to stop them to take down a tower, you really don't want to waste too much elixir trying to keep that tower up, trying to keep like 200 HP or something, because it'll probably go down eventually, and you won't be up at as much elixir as you would if you just kind of let it go down and then bring that back to them in a counter push or later in the game.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, and I think it definitely is. It's not a deck that I'm used to playing, like it being super aggressive with, you know, a really strong payoff at the end. I'm more of a like control defensive player, so I find that a little bit scary, to be honest with you. That you know you're going to be down a lot of matches sometimes against good players, especially you know, early on in the match. But it definitely thrives, I imagine, during double elixir time, especially when you have a pump on the map. But I do want to talk a little bit about the offensive, you know, the offensive win condition of this deck. And let's start out with, you know, there's no better place to start out than the 3 Musketeers. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your philosophy? You can see in the background through your replays here that you don't split the 3 Musketeers every time. So can we just start out by talking about when you split your 3 Musketeers and when you don't, and in which scenarios would call for either action?
Yeah, so really it depends on a few things. In this particular deck, during this particular meta game, if that makes sense, I'm not too afraid to go all in on one side once they've used something like lightning, especially if I'm familiar with. A lot of the time you can kind of tell what deck archetype they're playing, and if they use a lot of the decks, if they use lightning, they don't really have anything else good except maybe sometimes skeleton army against all 3 musketeers, but you just have to have zap ready for that. And so once the lightning comes out, and you know they can't cycle back to it fast enough, so you know you can't wait for them to play 3 or 4 more cards, but you got to place it down soon after. But if the lightning has just come down, a lot of times you can play the Three Musketeers on one side in this metagame. But you have to be careful if you're playing, this works if you're playing the Giant Three Musketeer version, but if you're playing the other version of the deck, it's more wise to try to split almost every time just because of the way the deck functions without a huge tank like the Giant. But with this Giant sort of version, you have a huge tank with the Giant, and then you have the Three Musketeers all behind one of them. And that's a very intimidating push for your opponent to stop when they have Lightning out of hand and they don't have anything else great in their deck to stop that.
Yeah, that is definitely intimidating. So why don't you talk about the absolute perfect win condition or absolute perfect Three Musketeers split? So tell me about what cards you're going to combo with the Three Musketeers in which lane.
Yeah, so normally if I split the Three Musketeers, I would put the Giant in front of the One Musketeer side, and then if they don't counter the Two Musketeers, I'll force them to really make it hard for them to counter it by putting the Ice Golem in front of that. And the Ice Golem's really nice in that instead of like a Knight being 3 elixir to force them to counter that lane, it's only 2 elixir to force them to counter. And then let's say they use the Lightning on the Two Musketeers, so I don't place the Ice Golem down. In that case, I would try to build up a big push behind my Giant side. So I'd have something like Giant, Musketeer, Mega Minion, Ice Spirit, maybe add in another Musketeer if I have some collectors up and it's double elixir time. And a lot of times it's very hard for them to stop that because they're used to, if they see a Giant Musketeer Mega Minion coming in, they can just Lightning that. But now that they don't have Lightning, it's very hard for them to stop that, and they'll often take a tower and sometimes even lead to 3 crown.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely a solid combo for sure. Are you? This might be kind of an irrelevant question, but I'm just curious. Do you always play the Three Musketeers first and then the Giant afterwards, or do you play the Giant behind your tower first when you're gearing up for a really big push? Let's pretend you already have a pump down, for example.
So if they're playing a deck with Lightning in it, then it means that you have to play the Three Musketeers behind your tower unless you know they don't have Lightning in hand. Because if you play them kind of in the middle of the field, if they have 6 elixir, then they can Lightning all 3 of them. So you have to split them behind your King Tower, or else you give them a 6 for 9 elixir trade, which is not what you want to be doing. The only exception to that is if you kind of have a feel for they're very, very low on elixir, they're at like 1 or 2 elixir, then the Musketeers will move away from each other fast enough that they won't be able to catch them. But usually if you have 3 Musketeers, they're kind of saving up and they'll get all 3 if you put them in the middle of the field. But if they don't have Lightning, I prefer to actually split the 3 Musketeers in the middle and place the Giant in the back first, because that can lead up to a bigger push just because of how slow the Giant is. Yeah. If you place the Giant in the back, then split the 3 Musketeers with 2 going the other way, and then you can still build up so much elixir before that Giant gets to the bridge.
Okay, so that's a pretty simple rule. So if your opponent has Lightning, you're going to go ahead and place them behind the King Tower whenever possible, unless they're very low on elixir. If your opponent doesn't have Lightning, you're going to place the Giant first and then be a little bit more aggressive with those big pushes with the 3 Musketeers in the middle of the field. And you mentioned, or obviously to kind of start out this video, is you mentioned that your ideal push obviously is using the 4th Musketeer and the Mega Minion as well in terms of a bait. So how does that play into your ideal push?
So a lot of times actually is when you play like your single Musketeer and or Mega Minion on defense, they'll use Lightning. And so that gives you the opening to play the 3 Musketeers, and depending on if they have another counter, like for example, if they have Barbarians, you'll still want to split them. But if not, then you can play them all on the same side. And then once they Lightning that and you play the 3 Musketeers all on the same side, they'll clean up on defense. And then you can counter push by placing a Giant in front before they walk up to the bridge. You can get kind of a huge push going down on one side. So that's the alternative to the split push, is if they choose to Lightning your Collector and or your Musketeer and Mega Minion, and you still have enough elixir, you can counter push them with a Giant 3 Musketeers push all on one side and really punish them.
I like that for sure. And it's definitely, I see some of these matches where you're getting like literally 5 Musketeers on the map. So it's definitely really overwhelming if they go unchecked. Can you talk a little bit about the Ice Golem and its role and utility in this deck, both offensively and defensively?
Yeah, so Ice Golem, as I said, usually acts as a tank on offense. So it's good if you have kind of one Musketeer and you want to support it with a tank. That if you have a one Musketeer that just did something on defense, you want to support it with the tank, but you don't want to spend too much. So you place an Ice Golem in front, kind of force them to deal with it. Um, or as I mentioned earlier, also in the split push in front of the two Musketeers, and then kind of on defense. What you want to use an Ice Golem for is basically can soak up hit points and it can kite units to the other lane. So, for example, if your opponent plays a mini P.E.K.K.A, has like a lone mini P.E.K.K.A coming onto the field, you can play the Ice Golem slightly in the other lane as it crosses the bridge. It'll chase it all the way into the other lane, and your towers will deal with it as it runs through the middle. So the Ice Golem really has a lot of utility in defense in terms of either sometimes you can just place it down to stall like your opponent's troops and give your other defensive troops that are doing damage a bit more time, or you can kite troops into the opposite lane and let the other tower deal with them. So you can kind of split up synergies.
Yeah, that's a lot of usage for 2 elixirs, so I can see definitely why you play it. If people for whatever reason don't have their Ice Golem leveled up, is there a good substitute? Would you just put in the Knight in that spot, or Miner or something? Or
I'd recommend either Knight or Miner.
Okay.
Could both work.
Okay, and defensively, what do you struggle against the most? Obviously this deck is actually really good against the current meta. That's one of the reasons that I had you on to talk about it. But is there one deck that you go against where you're like, okay, this might be difficult?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. A lot of decks probably with something like Giant Prince or maybe even like Golem Prince would be tough, just because of the fact that I don't have something like guards or even skeletons. I don't really have a distraction troop. I can kite it with the Ice Golem, but if they build up a big push, including a charging unit like a Prince, I think that would be tough for me. Or really any deck that had something like Barbarians in addition to something like Fireball or Lightning would be tough, just because of the fact that I rely on the fact that once they use their Lightning, I can usually bring the 3 Musketeers out, or the Musketeer and the Mega Minion. But then they also have an additional answer to that. Barbarians is the best example. Valkyrie can sometimes also work, but I can sometimes deal with that also with the Zap or the Ice Spirit. But really, if they have another answer to that, this deck works well because almost no one is playing Barbarians now. But if you saw that a lot, I don't think this deck would work as well.
Yeah, that's true. Like a Barbarian with a rocket and poison or fireball would be like your worst nightmare. But you're right. No one's running those 3 cards together, or at least very few and far between. What is the biggest mistake you see people playing, making when they're using a 3 Musketeer, or in this case, a 4 Musketeer deck?
So a lot of times I see people, as I said earlier, they oftentimes give their opponents a value Lightning. Or Rocket by playing either all 3 Musketeers on the same side, or in the case of Lightning, just playing the 3 Musketeers up in front of their King Tower, and then they can catch them all with a Lightning. Another thing I see is that you have to be really careful with where you place your 3 Musketeers in relation to your elixir pumps. So if you have an elixir pump in the middle in front of your King Tower, you don't want to place your 3 Musketeers right in front of it unless they're going to walk away immediately, so you don't want to play them in defense right in front of it if your opponent has something like Fireball, Rocket, Lightning, because what they can do is they can hit, in the case of like Fireball, they can hit all 3 of your Musketeers and your Elixir Pump, and that's insane value for them, right? So you have to be really careful about either playing your Elixir Pumps in the back, or if you're going to play them in the middle, maybe because they have something like Rocket, or you're concerned about them playing something like Miner, you can, if you're going to put them in the middle, you just have to be careful about always splitting your 3 Musketeers up in front of the Elixir Pump, and then making sure that they're going to walk away quickly enough that your opponent is going to be able to catch good enough value for them on spells.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there about placement on the Elixir Pump and obviously the 3 Musketeers. And with that, it kind of wraps up all the questions I had for you, Jar Jar. Do you have any parting words, any shout-outs? I know you're a member of Reddit Alpha. Any like I said, shout-outs or anything like that?
Well, I don't know if I want to pick someone out specifically because other people might be mad, but just shout out to everyone in Reddit Alpha in general. been a great clan environment and have helped me improve a lot, practice a lot, and have a lot of great friends there. And yeah, I just want to say thanks again for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and I hope all the viewers enjoyed the tips, and I hope it helps them out. I can probably comment on the YouTube video, or maybe you can put it in the description. I'm actually have like a YouTube channel which I don't post on too often, but maybe like once a week, once every 2 weeks.
Nice.
I'll put up a video, usually of my gameplay. So if you want to check that out, I'd be appreciative.
Yeah, I'll definitely include that link in the description, guys, as well as your Twitter. Do you mind if people contact you on Twitter? I know that a lot of my previous guests have really, embraced the community, so to speak, giving tips and deck advice here and there.
Yeah, no, I don't mind if you can contact me on Twitter. Yeah, if you put that in the description.
Will do.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, yeah.
Well, it's very generous of you, and thanks again for taking so much of your time to help us master the Quad Musketeer deck. And again, thanks so much for coming on, man. You've been great to talk to.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. All right, guys, so that was it. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I thought JarJar brought a lot of good quality tips and technique to the table. If you guys know a pro who you'd like to see on my channel, one stipulation is I am making it 16 plus now. I don't want to have to deal with parents. So hopefully you guys can go ahead and find some 16 plus pros. And if you do, hit me up on Twitter, and I'd love to have them on. Guys, thanks so much for watching all the way till the end. And as always, take care, guys.